Thank you everyone for joining us. Today we have Beyond White Feminism, Not Healing the US Back to an Anti-Feminist Future with Koa Beck, Benita Roth, and Barbara Smith. I'm going to do a quick intro of Koa and then pass it off to her. So Koa is actually one of our former Shorenstein Fellows. We're very happy to have her back for this. She's the former editor-in-chief of Jezebel and co-host of the Me Too memos on NYC's The Takeaway. As I mentioned, she was a Joan Shorenstein Fellow in spring 2019, which seems like a million years ago now. And she recently published a paper with us. You can find that on our website as well, and I'll put a link in the chat. She was previously the executive editor of Vogue.com and the senior features editor at marieclaire.com. For her reporting on gender, LGBTQ rights, culture, and race. She's spoken at Harvard Law School, Columbia Journalism School, the New York Times, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, among other institutions. She's also been interviewed by BBC for her insight into American feminism. Her literary criticism and reporting have appeared in The Atlantic, Out, The New York Observer, The Guardian, Esquire, Vogue, Marie Claire. She was also the guest editor of the 2019 special Pride edition of the New York Times, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And her new book, White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind, was just published a few weeks ago. So thank you for joining us, and Koa, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you everyone for coming. I have been very excited to have this discussion, mostly because the two wonderful speakers that we're going to be hearing from today have deeply influenced me in the way that I think about gender and gender politics, and I hope they will for you as well. Professor Bonita Roth studies the interaction of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and class in post-war social protest. Her book, Separate Roads to Feminism, Black, Chicana, and White Feminist Movements in America's Second Wave, published by Cambridge University Press, won the 2006 Distinguished Book Award from the Sex and Gender section of the American Sociological Association. She has also published on gender dynamics within the militant anti-AIDS movement, on racial, ethnic, and class inequities among working women, specifically domestic workers in the United States. During the academic year 2006 to 2007, she was awarded a 2007 SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. She was an associate editor for the Journal of Women's History from 2010 to 2015. Professor Roth's second book, The Life and Death of ACT UP/LA, Anti-AIDS Activism in Los Angeles from the 1980s to the 2000s, was published by Cambridge University in 2017. Professor Roth is currently working on researching grassroots responses to the opioid epidemic from an intersectional perspective that considers gender, race, ethnicity, class, and sexuality as key components of these responses. Professor Roth is the director of Binghamton University's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. Welcome, Benita.
Thank you.
Barbara Smith is an author, activist, and independent scholar who has played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national, cultural, and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She was among the first to define an African-American women's literary tradition and to build Black women's studies and Black feminism in the United States. She has been politically active in many movements for social justice since the 1960s. Her career is documented in Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith, SUNY Press. Smith was a co-founder of the Combahee River Collective in 1975 and of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press in 1981, the first US publisher for women of color to reach a wide national audience. She served 2 terms as a member of the City Council in Albany, New York from 2006 to 2013. In 2005, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for being here and chatting with us. So I'm going to start with, especially given that both of you are such deep feminist thinkers in your respective rights, I'm really curious from, in some ways, your different corners of the world, what gender issues have you seen play out in the COVID-19 pandemic, and how do they parallel long-standing feminist structural critiques?
Barbara, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Just want to make sure I'm not muted. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with both of you. So what we have seen is that the pandemic in the United States is affecting women, and undoubtedly people who are gender nonconforming, people who are define themselves as queer, people who are trans, in much more severe ways than it is others. And some of the statistics that I was looking at this morning about people who have left the workforce, that disproportionately women to take care of the kids who are now at home, the homeschooling, the distance learning, whatever they call it. That's, so much is now falling into women's laps in traditional domestic arrangements. But also what we've seen is that the people who are now being defined as essential workers, who used to be referred to as service workers, and other names and titles that were not very respectful, but now who are essential workers, they are disproportionately women of color and women who don't earn nearly enough to be able to survive on. So as always, it's working class and poor women of color who are kind of shoring it up for everybody else. And in your book, Koa, you write about at length about how the wonderful careers of the lean-in white feminists are made possible by the women who I am describing, who have been most disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And let's not forget, of course, the absolutely disproportionate amount of illness and death that our Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Latinx communities are experiencing. So that's what I've observed.
Benita?
So yeah, I think there's three ways or three broad categories of where we're seeing kind of the fault lines, COVID exposing the fault lines. So one is this question of who's the essential worker and what are they able to do, and how are they able to make their lives given their essentialness, right? And here you can look at mainstream media, including leftist rags like Forbes, that will show you, quite conclusively show you that it's women who are bearing the brunt of unemployment. It's women of color who are bearing even more of the brunt of unemployment. The unemployment rates are actually higher for them. And that it's not clear when or if they'll be able to come back into the workforce. And we can have a separate conversation sometimes about whether or not these essential workers were actually valued workers before COVID, because a lot of them really were not. They were at the bottom of the ladder in terms of how much power they had over their work experience. Second is questions of healthcare. There are healthcare deserts in the United States. Public health folks know this. Everybody else with occasional blips wants to ignore this. We've had a variety of discussions about Medicare for all, expanding Obamacare, all these kinds of questions, but the COVID pandemic has really revealed where there are healthcare deserts, urban cores and rural America as well. Also, can't really call it a desert, that's a spatial metaphor, but undocumented folks are not able to access the kind of care they need. And they're the folks in the meatpacking plants, and they're the folks in the fields, and they're the folks doing a lot of, or they were doing a lot of the domestic care that allowed the kind of lean-in feminists to get into the workforce. Lastly, there's the overall care crisis. The kids are not in school. Who's going to have to stay home with them? We have no national laws around sick days. We have no national laws around vacation days. We have no national laws around leave, parental or otherwise. And in that, we are not just outliers among so-called developed countries, we're just plain outliers among countries in the world in not giving families the kind of leave they need. I believe you mentioned it in your Time magazine piece, Koa, but the law that governs things nationally is the Family and Medical Leave Act. It's a relic of the Clinton administration. It has barely been updated. It allows for 12 weeks of unpaid leave in the event of necessary medical care or adoption or having a kid. And because of that constriction of unpaid leave and other ways in which the law is written, probably only about 40% of American workers can even qualify for unpaid leave. So I would say that that's what COVID has revealed in terms of the fault lines and fissures in our care regimes, in our work regimes, in our healthcare regimes.
Thank you for that concise summary from both of you. And just so everybody in the webinar is aware, myself and the speakers are going to be making reference to, various articles and books and things like that. And I'm going to make a point in the chat to drop them in so that you have them and you can read them after the discussion and share them.
Good, thanks.
My next question is for Barbara specifically. Last summer, you published a piece in The Nation laying out a plan to dismantle white supremacy, advocating for an integrated approach across economic policies, education, childcare, healthcare, criminal justice, and other dimensions. I respond to this very deeply because, and I get into this in my own book, but I feel like in my lifetime specifically, systemic racism is treated as something that can be alleviated through like bias training or like, sensitivity education or like these other very ineffectual programs that do not address the scope of white supremacy. So what does addressing white supremacy in this, as you say, I'm quoting you, holistic way, accomplish for women and other marginalized genders? And I'm going to be dropping this Nation piece in the chat.
Thank you, Koa. Of course, half of any population that is defined as people of color, over half are women. And then when you add gender nonconforming and non-binary, etc., then you're getting up there in the numbers. So obviously, addressing white supremacy is going to have impact on that group just across the board. One of the things, or a major thing I was trying to convey in this dialogue about race in the United States that was absolutely made more urgent by the lynching of George Floyd is that white supremacy is a system. It is not like a set of bad attitudes toward people who are different from you. In the United States, there has never been any serious desire to address what I just said, because the system of white supremacy is part and parcel of how this country functions and what makes life in the United States for some work, and in some cases work well, because the major purpose of white supremacy is to advantage white people and to disadvantage those who are not white. And that has economic repercussions. Of course, the stealing of the land from the indigenous inhabitants accomplished through removal and actual genocide, and then the establishment of chattel slavery, those were economic arrangements. It wasn't just that we don't like indigenous people, we don't like Africans, we think they're inferior. No, the ideology followed the economic imperatives. So that's where we come from. And I wanted to push that national dialogue, people who have, get to be talking heads, etc. I wanted to push the national dialogue so that we would have a clear sense of what we're talking about. And I'm just as committed to that. There's just as much need today as there was back in May when I started writing what is now 4 different articles about that.
Oops, I can't hear Koa.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Barbara, for that overview. Benita, your book, Separate Roads to Feminism, was very important to me in researching my book to understand the different ways women across race both conceived of and executed their feminisms in the second wave. Do you find that these dynamics, from a sociological perspective, have resurfaced post Women's March, or to your assessment, have they shifted into a different dialogue?
Yes, so I think that a key difference between then and the book, I wrote the book about what I saw as organizationally distinct feminist organizing done by Chicanas, African-American women, and white women on the women's liberation side of things, so the leftier side, in the 60s and 1970s. And I think that the key thing that has happened, although it was part of the feminist theorizing of activists among feminists of color, is that the idea of intersectionality has been mainstreamed, right? And it's been explicitly named, and it is at least nodded to as a kind of set of political goals, right? So that we need to talk. I'm not saying it always happens, but we need to talk across questions of not just gender, but also how it allays with, how it intersects, how these dominations mutually can constitute each other, sexuality, class not discussed as much, which I think is really an important thing to think about in terms of Koa's work. Because what's left behind, of course, is working class women and poor families, and poor everybody, really. But so I would say the main difference is there's now kind of this explicit category around which we might organize, think, theorize in an intersectional fashion, and it's been given that name. Intersectionality has traveled all over the world. It's gotten a little bit fuzzy or a lot fuzzy, depending on your perspectives. And people very often mean quite different things about by intersectionality when they organize. Do you want me here now to talk a little bit about the march as a sociological phenomenon? Okay. The Women's March and other large marches like this, and there's a gender historian, Deborah Gray White, some people may know that name, who's written recently a book called Lost in the USA, in which she looks really at what the large scale marches, the Million Man March, the Promise Keepers, the LGBT marches in Washington specifically. And I think she also covers some marches that happened in Philly and a few other places, like the Million Women's March. She looks at how these large scale marches are giving people a way to express identity, right, in communal ways. And they come to Washington, the symbolic center of the country, and that this is how they make their kind of political connections. There's also a sociologist, Amin Ghaziani, who's written specifically around conflict in the creation of the LGBT marches that happened from sort of the 80s to the early 2000s. And he specifically argues that the conflict in the planning of these events was generative and helped to foster and cement network relationships, particularly between like the coastal elites and sort of the American heartland. I think that in the internet age, these large scale marches are something we're going to continue to see because they're rather easy to put together. And they do give people this sense of community and expression. From there, I wonder, right? Like how much of it comes back away from, in this case, Washington or, the other cities in which these large scale marches happened. From there, I wonder, like, what's going to happen then on the ground? It's not that I'm against the marches. I think marches are good. They're fine. They're spectacle. They're fun, right? They're ludic, to use a word, carnivalesque, that I picked up a little while ago, that I really like for some reason. But from the standpoint of what kind of momentum do they create, that is a question for me. And maybe Barbara wants to pick up on this or not, around the question of momentum.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting hearing you talk about these marches, because some of the ones that you're describing, I was actually a part of, and a part of the fights, particularly those LGBTQ marches of the 1990s, probably 80s into 90s.
Right.
And that's a really good question of like, what's the momentum that's accomplished? I feel like in some ways the splits that occurred in relationship to what was called, I think, the Millennium March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. I think that clarified different parts of the movement at that time. And that was kind of my exit, that was my exit cue when that was happening, because that was also a time of gays in the military being a big issue. Don't ask, don't tell was, coming to the fore. And those of us who are on the left, who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, we had different perspectives about what was going on. And I think I heard you mention how class doesn't come into it very often. A part of our critique, besides the obvious racial critique, was also a class critique. Most people who are queer, and there are all kinds of terms, so we use them, we use as many as we possibly can to make sure that everybody hears their kind of name being and their identity being recognized. But queer people, particularly during the 1990s, were being characterized as rich, gay, white men who really didn't have any other problems, except for homophobia. And that really left everybody else just out in the cold. And as we know now, the people who are most likely to experience hate crimes because of their gender presentation or sexual orientation, all of those things coming together, are trans women, specifically trans women of color who don't have economic privilege. So yeah, it's all coming to roost. And I think that it's for us to think about. This is a kind of women's movement, I think, that Koa wants to see us build, one that takes into account something besides the C-suites and the slick magazine coverage, etc.
Right.
Thank you, Barbara. In terms of, how a lot of the conversations that we're having now get translated, and especially in thinking about like COVID, and I think broader understandings of people comprehending systemic failures. Benita, late last year, there was an op-ed in the New York Times entitled "Feminism Has Failed Women," full stop, wasn't qualified in any capacity. How do you engage with this particular narrative of feminism, and how is this assessment flawed? And I will be dropping this op-ed in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I think among reactions for Zoom, there really should be like an eye roll, although I'm not quite sure how you would do it. So so we were talking about this a little bit right before this seminar. I am so beyond tired with the feminism has failed and its close cousin, the feminist is dead, feminism is dead, and its possibly more distant cousin, but not really. Younger women don't like the feminist label. It's all a very kind of superficial critique, and it's demonstrably wrong, right? Which is the other part of it. So the feminism has failed. And all I can say about that piece, and if people want to go read it, it's not that long, is, and actually talking to you, Koa, maybe I'm wrong about this, is that maybe, some boneheaded editor just slapped that headline on it because they know that it's a headline that will, get clicks. But what's interesting about the piece, and what's interesting often about this kind of feminism has failed, feminism is dead kinds of articles, is that the author wants feminism to have succeeded, but defines feminism quite narrowly. And I think this is probably something you address in your book, which is it's that kind of lean in Sheryl Sandberg feminism with the expectation that everyone was able to become an entrepreneur, everybody was able to make it to the management suite. There's even a piece in the Washington Post today about female entrepreneurs doing their best with COVID, right? So to the extent that feminism gets defined as this upper white, cisgender, gender conforming white, I said white twice now, I'll say it again, white thing, of course you would want to react against that, right? Because it doesn't take in all the kinds of problems that women and families across the board have, that when they're trying to make do, right? And these are problems that feminists on the left, feminists of color, and white feminists on the left have been talking about: the structural problems, the lack of family policy, the lack of worker rights, right? They have been talking about it from, there's hundreds of books, there's thousands of articles, both scholarly and mainstream press. We have been talking about it. We've talked about it a lot. We constantly talk about it. It's just, it's A, not heard, B, dismissed, and it's dismissed in a very particular way, which is that, anybody can take their bootstraps, pull themselves up, look at all the opportunities women have, et cetera, et cetera. So that individualist, constant drumbeat of American culture and political culture really just does this work of obscuring the fact that there are dozens and hundreds and thousands of feminists and other activists on the ground arguing for a $15 minimum wage, which, by the way, is probably not enough, arguing for the end of mass incarceration, arguing for more money, towards healthcare, not militarizing the police. There's tons of people doing that, right? They just don't look like the picture of the feminist you've painted, which you then, as narrowly as you painted it, you still want to knock down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very, very much so. And I feel like a lot of what you're describing, Benita, I mean, I went to great lengths to both define and in some ways like debunk for readers of my book, where I feel like something that I've been really witness to, especially with my career and roles that I've had, is this very, in some ways, like flattening and homogenizing of contemporary feminism, where one of the facets that I explore in my book is like at the top of the pandemic, there were all these sort of, I mean, you can set your watch by them, like these like trend pieces about white collar or like middle class-ish women who, are trying to juggle and balance and like all those weird words that, somehow got indoctrinated into this like mainstream feminist discourse. And they are depicted by like the Times specifically as, locking themselves in their bathrooms to like make business calls. And then they're, having like phone meetings in their car because their children are running amok in the house. And something that was very interesting to me in finishing up my book and then, seeing these responses to the pandemic was that in these quotes that, journalists got from these women, you can almost, or at least I can, you can read between the lines and hear like they think that white feminism is going to come save them, from these circumstances, when in actuality, that ideology and that approach to gender progress has never been about structural critique. It's always been about elevating the individual and making sure that she has, in whatever capacity, her most empowered avenues. It's not about making sure that, you're able to complete domestic work, that is compensated, or that, the people who perform it with you have healthcare. Like that's never been what white feminism has advocated for.
Right, it's unreconstructed liberal feminism. I might even call it neoliberal feminism. It's consonant with the way in which governments throughout the world are now trying to offload their responsibilities for the care of their people, right? And offload them onto individual families. And of course, anytime you say individual families, for the most part, you're talking about, the women who are part of those families.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
I'd like to jump in if I could.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. When you were talking, Bonita, I was thinking that the way that the mainstream and the power structure does everything possible not to look at the real situation of women across all identities, classes, genders, etc. That is the same as with white supremacy.
Absolutely.
We're talking about, what you were talking about is making sure that patriarchal relationships and arrangements, and particularly power relationships, get maintained.
Mhm.
So we'll put out that false version of what feminism is, that little narrow, what we used to call bourgeois feminism, neoliberal,
Right.
all of it works. White feminism, neoliberal, bourgeois, it's still the same mess. But
Yeah.
the thing is that, like by putting out that very narrow and false version, then people can go through a whole lifetime not really understanding why they can't get anywhere and why it's so hard for them to do the basic task of daily life. It's a state that does not support, does not support families, which means supporting women. They just don't do it. And I've always felt, as I think other scholars, would confirm, that one of the reasons we have such a flimsy, almost non-existent family policy in the United States is because of racism.
Agreed.
It's because they can't bear the idea that people who are completely unworthy and whose situation is their own damn fault, they can't stand the idea of the state doing anything to alleviate that. So they will cut off their nose to spite their face. The fact that we don't have these policies like family leave and, etc.
Right.
It's because this nation has never had a robust social safety network because they had to maintain white supremacy at all costs. And you can see that in many, many different iterations of when the state could and should have stepped in to save people.
Right.
Even Hurricane Katrina is an example.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Barbara, one of the things I wanted to be sure and address specifically for the audience, in case they're unaware, I think this is really pertinent to our topic and the way that we think about gender rights and gender progress, and also how we even, have conversations like this nationally. Barbara, you have said publicly that quote unquote identity politics is often misused in contemporary discourse. I'm really interested, and I think it would be good for other people listening to hear, how do you think this misuse has shaped dialogues on racial justice and gender equality?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak truth about that. Identity politics that term has become like a whipping boy or a whipping girl, for all kinds of errors and all kinds of oppressions to be perpetrated. Nobody ever deals with the concept of white identity politics. And as we saw when the people ran into the Capitol on January 6th, white identity politics is really, 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 really robust and very, very, very dangerous and frightening. I mean, what did those people have in common? They talk about, most of the people who tried to overthrow the US government were white. That's white identity politics dead up. And what were they trying to resist? They were trying to resist the votes of people who look like me. They were trying to overturn those votes, voter suppression. But anyway, I just want to share with people the origins of identity politics. We use that term. And I say we, I'm talking about the three co-authors of the Combahee River Collective Statement, and that would be Demeter Frazier, my sister Beverly Smith, and myself. When we wrote that in 1977, we used the term identity politics, in fact, coined the term as far as we know. We coined the term identity politics to mean that Black women had a right to determine our own political agendas, that we had the right to build a political agenda and a political practice based upon the interlocking identities that we had, and that without taking into account those identities, it would be like the title of a book I've heard of, which is All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. That's my book and my title. And that's what we are trying to guard against, and what we are trying to fight against, which is you can't just do Black politics and think that it's going to encompass the experiences of women of color and Black women specifically. You just can't do white feminist politics and think it's going to encompass the experiences of women of color. So that's what we meant by identity politics. And people have taken it and run with it and done all kinds of bizarre and not really good things. But that's what we meant, that we had a right, the kind of politics that you write about, Koa, and the kinds of political agendas, that's what we meant. Like, look at the situation that these actual specific people are in. Is there a way forward? Is there a plan, a program, a policy agenda that will alleviate and change their objective oppression? That's it.
Thank you for that generous definition. I'd like to switch, since we're getting towards the latter part of the discussion now. I really want to get both of your assessments of where we've been in the last 4 years, but also just where we're going, and especially when we're trying to envision gender equality and what that could look like. Something I'm really interested to hear from both of you is, with Trump now officially out of office, what do you think is an unhelpful narrative of his presidency as it relates to gender progress or stagnation, or however that's being interpreted?
Barbara, go ahead. you made a face like I need to speak about this.
No, I made a face because there was a reference to the prior inhabitant of the White House.
Oh, okay.
I don't really have anything right now.
I do. The most unhelpful narrative, well, there's several of them. One is hinted at in the title of the seminar, which is the healing narrative, which I would just, again, like to play the sociologist card because I can. We use lots of metaphors from individuals that we try to scale up to societies, and healing is one of the ones that is not a good one. It just doesn't make any sense. I will also just say that another unhelpful narrative will be Trump as aberration. Trump was not an aberration, he was a culmination, okay? The way that I think about it, and I'm gonna apologize to any quilt makers here, because I respect you, is that he took a piece of white supremacy, he took a piece of misogyny, he took a piece of neoliberal populism, he took a piece of nativism, right? He took a piece of anti-LGBTQIA stuff. He took a piece of boneheaded American exceptionalism, right? I don't think he knew he was doing that last one. I think the others he did know. And he put it all together in this quilt that he then wanted to cover the land with. And let's be clear, it had a lot of resonance for a lot of people, or the best case scenario is that there were a lot of folks who were just willing to ignore all of the poison, the systemic poison, in order to support him for whatever kinds of reasons they had, whether they felt it as somebody would deliver them the racial privilege they needed, or the class privilege they needed, or the patriarchal authority they felt they needed, right? So again, Trump is not aberration, he's culmination, and Trumpism is not dead. And we need to think about it, even if we hate thinking about Trump.
Barbara.
And I would just say what she said.
Thank you.
No, you really, wrapped that up and tied it up with a bow. About that quilt that you described, when he was pulling all those pieces of bigotry. And I'm sorry about if you can hear what's in the background. Sorry. I didn't call for that to happen. It was a fire engine. Anyway, that quilt metaphor that you were using, I was thinking, yeah, he put all those pieces of the quilt together and then he used it to smother us.
Right.
That is just, you know, the level of degradation, the level of withdrawal of not very robust resources as it was. It was just really ridiculous. I think one of the things that you said that I like the most, because I had actually thought of this as well, he is not an aberration. And what he embodied is still very much with us. My understanding is that 87% of Republicans thinks that he did a bang up job post January the 6th. So that means we're in a lot of trouble. And that our movements, the way that we get out of these situations always is to organize.
Right.
Our movements have to be strong. They have to be clear. They have to be smart and strategic. And we have to be able to define which way forward. What do we need to do now that we're in another kind of paradigm? We can't lay back and think everything's going to be fine. We have a lot to grapple with still.
Thank you. I'm also personally, so my moderating duties aside, I am personally interested in what expectations each of you have for the Biden-Harris administration, and perhaps, you know, most importantly, what policies or platforms do you think that they should be pressured on?
Well, I'm tempted to say everything, but strategically, that's probably not possible. Look, I'm going to say something that makes my liberal/progressive friends here at the university not so happy with me. Americans don't elect leftists to the White House. They never have. I don't think they ever will, or at least not for a very long time. I don't expect to see it in my lifetime. They elect centrists and they elect rightists. When you have centrists in there, which Biden is, which Harris is, let's be clear, right? She's an institutionalist. She came up as a prosecutor, then the AG of California, and then a senator, right? When you have the centrists in, that's when you have the social movements that can push, because you can push them on certain programs and platforms and the like. My best hope would be that the COVID crisis it has revealed the fissures, but also leads to a kind of sea change in how we think about public health and healthcare provision. If I was queen and was organizing, you know, Benita's movement, that's probably where I would put my efforts. Having said that, there are a whole host of things around workers' rights, around the care crisis, which I keep bringing up because of how real it is, that I would also try to push for. I think, Koa, at one point you mentioned Harris had introduced a domestic workers' bill of rights on the federal level. We have something like that in New York. Its enforcement is dicey because of just a whole bunch of logistical questions and questions of government will. But that's the places I would push if I was willing to push. If again, I'm willing to push if I had, you know, my own minions. The last thing I will say also, because I think it's a hugely consequential question that we really don't see enough in racial and class terms, is the legalization of drugs, particularly marijuana, but not only. And there, it would be really helpful if there was some federal leadership around descheduling marijuana so that it's not classed as a more dangerous drug than heroin. And so that it allows the states where marijuana has been legalized, either for medical or what they call adult use, which always scares me, that would allow for those businesses to actually thrive, and that would allow for the thousands and thousands of people who have records because of possession charges or even dealing charges would allow them to expunge those records and go forward as human beings in the world, right? So that's a lot. I'm not quite sure what they'll get to, but now definitely is the time to push.
So some of mine are possible because there's actually legislation in Congress in existence, and some of them are like probably not. But I have to say that I ruefully chuckled when you said, Benita, that leftists don't get elected to president, because as somebody who was like riding for Bernie both in 2016 in 2020, yeah, I knew it was a long shot. Yeah, I'm a realist as well, but I think that that's an important strain that we see now in U.S. politics, U.S. electoral politics. We're seeing people who are willing, like Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, new members of the squad. The squad is now 6 people, as I understand it, with one male member, which is Jamal Bowman. That's a new trend that we're seeing that I think we can take some heart from in electoral politics. So I would say what I want to see, among other things, what the Biden administration to do is to, as I said in all of these articles that I've written, to confront white supremacy in a real way and to help inform the US populace what it is and what it isn't. Mm-hmm. And we're not talking about attacking white people. In none of my articles do I say anything horrible about white people. There are 4 articles, not a single syllable about how horrible white people are, because I don't believe that white people are horrible in and of themselves as a group. What I think is horrible is systemic white supremacy that leads some white people to have really, really bad perspectives about who they're sharing the planet with.
Right.
I would ask, I would want to see defund the police. I would want to see an end to mass incarceration. The Breathe Act from the Movement for Black Lives would be very helpful in that regard. The Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act would be something that needs to be passed. So, as I said, some are, in the hopper, so to speak, some not necessarily likely, but we really do need to, particularly that one about defund the police, not that it's more important than the other ones that I mentioned, but there is so much bad propaganda about what that actually means. It means stop putting the millions and the billions into militarizing our poor communities, primarily communities of color, and put it into that social net, safety net, that network of care that we have been talking about today, so that we can
mental health, for God's sakes.
Exactly.
My city is so my county is Broome County. It's an aging county in upstate New York. 200,000 people or so live here. The city of Binghamton is about 50,000 of those 200,000 people. We have a tank. Because of the funds that were, put out there for police departments to buy military hardware. We don't need a tank. There's a kind of insanity around the way that money gets spent around both the police and incarceration. It's horrifying, especially since, the money could be put in different places that would just be so much more consequential for the quality of life for people.
And that includes the lives of women.
Absolutely.
All the things that we've talked about in this last little segment, all of them would improve the lives of women if they were addressed. Mm-hmm. So just there's that.
I'm going now to transition to our audience questions, because we have so many and many of them are great, and I'd like to get answers to as many of them as possible because they are so smart. This question is from Anisha, and she says, how do we address white feminism in the context of academia and higher education, where many argue that there just isn't enough quote unquote data or quote unquote research on marginalized genders, including non-binary folks, LGBTQ women, women of color, and working class women.
Excuse me, not enough data about what? I mean, people have been, you know, have devoted careers
Yes.
to doing what some people, I guess, who this participant just who just asked the question, the people who are giving her pushback are giving them pushback, obviously is just overlooking and denying all the work that has been done. That's a really flimsy excuse for not being inclusive.
I agree. And I have a lot of personal feelings on this that I explore in my book, because a lot of my career and reporting that I've tried to get out there in stories, and also just working in the newsrooms that I have, with other women in leadership positions and, people who I have reported to and also people I've managed. I distill a lot of my own experiences with the quote unquote pipeline defense, which it sounds like is what you are talking about when you ask a question like that, where the talking point is essentially like, oh, we would hire Latinas, if they had experience, that qualified them for these roles. We would have more like Native, professors if they had PhDs. So what I make the point of in my book is that that's really a failed argument, in the sense that you're talking about all the avenues to having certain resources, degrees, experience, and those people are then sort of blamed again for not being able to succeed in those avenues. So it's really just a failure of structural critique. I echo Barbara when I say that there are, especially now, I would argue, there's a lot of archival data and studies and research. It's just a question of who the power holders will listen to. And I've had a lot of experience with that in terms of, when in my experience, especially in a lot of newsrooms, when a white woman says something, or a white passing woman, it registers differently in a meeting than when, a woman of color says it, or like a gender nonconforming person says it. So I think that the real question that you're asking is, how do you get power holders to assess the data that's already out there and that is present in the archive and in a lot of libraries, differing canons, different people's experiences. And I think that, in the way that is available to you, addressing who gets listened to and who is the authority on either this type of data or research would actually be more beneficial to you in addressing the inequalities that you're asking about. I hope that's helpful. Benita, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I do and I don't want to address it. There is data, whatever you think data is, whether you think it's surveys, whether you think it's counting who's in the academy, whether you look at the institutional burdens of representation that people of color, women of color, non-conforming folks in the academy get, which is, I think, a big part of the problem, is that when there's few of the person that is, when there's few of a person who's seen as part of a particular category, students flock to them, and then they get asked to do everything. And in some ways, that's a kind of textbook plan for having them fail in most parts of the American Academy, which is so focused on the one person as a discrete individual, occasionally part of a team publishing, right? Like my university. Your answer was very good, Koa. It's like, what can you find out? Do some keyword searches, do some web searches, and confront them with the data that, look, we don't have, we have, 3 of women of color or something in STEM, or we have, 0 women of color in STEM. You can granulate this as much as you want to, or you can take the bigger pictures and start to build out from there. Right now, the State University of New York, which is a large set of public institutions, is actively trying to recruit academics of color and academic women in the STEM fields. They're willing to put some money behind it. We'll see where that goes. I don't think it's just a question of money. I do think there are a whole set of changes in the academy that have to be made to get us out of this problem of the lack of representation of people who are, again, kind of a majority of the world.
Before we get to our next question, there is a really amazing comment here in the chat that I just want to share, and it's brief. Kathleen Sterling would like to point out the New York Times op-ed that we were discussing, specifically with Benita. She says it should have been titled "Capitalism Has Failed Women," which I think is really salient and true.
Yes.
Okay, our next question, this one is really great, and I'm actually really interested to hear both of you answer this. I have my own opinions on this. Susan Leonard asks, I was very interested in the discussion of bourgeois, neoliberal, white feminism, and the way these mindsets fail to approach the structural problems that we care about. Are there better terms we need to appropriate instead? I see quote unquote intersectional feminism used a bit. What framings would the three of you propose instead?
I don't really think the problem is what we call it. Well, the problem is like, how do we move? What do we do? What work do we see as being a part of a feminist agenda? I'm not sure that changing from intersectional feminism to solidarity feminism or cross-cultural feminism. I mean, I can't even think of any good terms, but it's not really about the words. People use those as excuses for this, for holding on to the very bad and negative politics and perspectives that they have already. So that's what I would say.
And I agree with Barbara in large part. The only thing I would just say is that from a historical perspective, I think it's important we recognize that there are always feminisms, plural, right? And that if we're thinking about what we want to do, there is a historical record you can draw from of people who have been thinking about what you're thinking about for a long time, right? Which is why I think part of the reason, Koa, you wrote that book, and certainly the reason I wrote my book, and the reason that it's out there. So go looking for it and don't worry so much about the label. Go looking for the people who did the people in the groups who did the things that you think are right.
And that's kind of a segue into something I wanted to make sure to express, which is that even though our topic is white feminism and Koa's wonderful book is titled White Feminism, people need to know that there is a tradition of anti-racist feminism.
Yes.
That goes back to at least the 19th century that no one ever talks about, because again, it's like, I never seen any of those Nicolas Cage movies, where he's looking for the original Declaration of Independence or whatever. I don't even know what they're about. But they're strange movies about origin stories of, the United States, etc. But the thing is that they keep these secrets, it's like under lock and key. They don't want you to know about Anne Braden, they don't want you to know about friends of mine, Adrienne Rich, Mab Segrest, Ellie Bolkin, Minnie Bruce Pratt. They don't want you to know about those people, because if you knew about them, you would think differently.
Right.
And you would act differently, and you might see different possibilities. So yes, white feminism is real, it's a thing, but so is anti-racist feminism, a story yet to be told.
And socialist feminism.
On an
international level, then and now. It exists. Go find those folks. Don't be afraid of the word socialist. It's hilarious.
Yeah, I would be one of those.
Yeah.
I will add that per the question that was just asked, in terms of intersectional feminism, I feel like what I'm hearing in your question I'm pretty sensitive to, given my age, because as important as Kimberly Crenshaw is to really a lot of things that we've spoken about today, I feel like in my lifetime specifically, I have watched that term intersectional feminism be sanitized away from her and her politics and be used in this very kind of like decorative, like Twitter bio kind of a way that is supposed to signal to me and other people that like,
You're woke.
you know, yeah, that you're like this very like class conscious feminist. And I don't know really what I'm supposed to do with that, you know, when I see that in a very decorative capacity. But I do echo Barbara and Benita when I say that in terms of tracing terms and terminology, a lot of what I explore in my book and that I've seen throughout things that I've witnessed is that a lot of these words, unfortunately, will be commodified and sold back to us.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't really matter what the word is, at least to me, and I think to the other speakers who are here. At some point, some brand will find it and put it on a tote bag and sell it to you at a conference about like women's empowerment or whatever. Mm-hmm. So my advice would be, you already cited in your question, you know, structural critique and being aware of that. I would retain that lens as you move through these different movements. And also language will change. I mean, there will be new movements that use, you know, a different array of vocabulary to describe either oppression or identity. And I think a longstanding thing that I took away from a lot of research from my book is that all these different feminisms and movements, the ones that are the most salient and the ones that are the most enduring are very articulate in structural oppression and in understanding the structures that oppose and oppress marginalized genders. And that's the enduring theme, regardless of whether that's like a Native movement or Chicanas or Black lesbian feminism. That is an enduring piece that I think is really important. We are sadly at time, so I cannot answer the rest of these questions, although they were great. But Barbara is on Twitter. Benita's email is public. So if you would like to engage with them further and ask those questions there, I encourage you to do that. Thank you everyone for coming, and especially Ali and Liz and everyone at the Joan Shorenstein Center for putting together these logistics so that you could have a conversation like this. Thank you so much to Benita and Barbara for being so generous with their time and insight. It really means a lot to me. I really enjoyed this. I hope you did too, and I'll see you online.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
So long.
Bye.